Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about how businesses respond to gentrification in New York City, and I'm also using the NETS data. So thanks to Luke for introducing that. So this project and a couple others, which I'll probably reference, is really motivated by this question that keeps coming up: whether gentrification is good or bad. And I don't have the answer today, and the answer is still kind of both. But so it was, motivated by this intuition that we understand, if you study gentrification or neighborhood change, it's complicated. So it presents both opportunities for everyone, for residents possibly, for businesses certainly, but also great challenges. And so one of the biggest concerns with gentrification that comes up a lot is this question of displacement, right? Are people getting pushed out through while the neighborhood is changing? A lot of research and attention has focused on the residential side of things. And actually, a lot of the evidence does not support the expectation of displacement. I mean, we see it happening. This is not to say it does not happen, but the empirical evidence doesn't say it's happening in some kind of systematic way. And so that raised another question for me as well. If people are not being pushed out in droves, I mean, this is not to say that's not happening in very bad cases, but this suggests that people do stay, right? And so then this is next question of, well, if they stay, are there benefits from potentially the increased investment that comes there? So does it come from localized investment? And then the other side of that, which has not received as much attention, is what does it mean for the commercial activity that's there? And I think, again, it presents both sides, right? Potential benefits, but also great costs possibly to facing this kind of neighborhood change. So, right, this is not the group I have to convince that, right, commercial activity is important for neighborhoods, especially mixed-use neighborhoods, which is what typically comprises urban centers and spaces, right? These are people living and working and consuming all in the same spaces. And that this commercial activity provides places, obviously, where these very economic transactions take place, but also they're places of cultural value. These businesses provide services to the community, and they also provide jobs. I've done some other work looking in the context of gentrification to see how that affects employment. I'll probably reference that briefly in a minute. And that these are a source of livelihood for the people that own these. So on a lot of fronts, we should be understanding what's happening to these entities, right? It should matter to people from a lot of perspectives. So just a little kind of very simple, crude theoretical framing of what I'm going to get into, which basically comes down to this idea that under conditions of gentrification, which, as I said before, I really think of as some kind of shock to a neighborhood, right? There's kind of extreme change that's happening there. These neighborhood businesses might be the most vulnerable, right, in the spectrum of kind of commercial activity. So we can think of commercial entities locating, right, based on two kind of sides of the equation, right? So there's consumer demand, right? So they're going to go there to meet some consumer demand in terms of volume, but also the composition of that demand, right, is going to determine the kinds of services and businesses that are there. And then there's the cost side, right? How much does it cost to set up the operation and then keep it going? And so under gentrification, both of these things change, right? The demand changes. You have a new crop of people that are coming in there to live there with different tastes, with different demands for the kinds of services, the products that are going to be there, and costs obviously change. This is underlying that main concern of displacement. Rents are expected to go up. So this changes the equation on both sides. And then, if you're a business that relies on localized consumer base, you're going to feel this multifold, right? That if this is where you draw your business from and that population is shifting, it could be quite threatening. It could present opportunities, right, if you can adjust and kind of adapt to that, but it can also be threatening if you can't. So this project, kind of as the one that was presented right before, it's descriptive. This was to document what's going on because no one had really done that, just to understand, do we see elevated rates of retention and displacement under conditions of gentrification? Is that true? Up against our expectations, up against what we kind of see with our own eyes, when that corner store closes down. And then what does that mean? What does that mean for local services and commercial stability more broadly? So what do we know so far? There's, a pretty good number of studies that just document that there's disparities in access to commercial services. We know that that's true. Poorer communities of color tend to have fewer retail establishments, and certain types of establishments, again, as was just documented, tend to cluster in poorer communities. There's also evidence to suggest that neighborhoods that appreciate, or kind of another term that's used, economically upgrade, right? Or gentrify, although gentrify is more than just economic change, we see that the number of retail establishment does increase and grow there, and that there is more churn, there is more turnover. So here I'm trying to really disentangle what that turnover looks like. Not a lot as much on how residents feel about these new services, right? So the idea, I think the kind of naive idea, is that these services come in, it's a good thing, they're getting maybe grocery stores they didn't have, but if those stores don't sell products that appeal to them, or don't have prices that are affordable to incumbent residents, again, that's and the evidence is mixed on that in terms of welcoming, but also being hesitant about these new services coming in. And then I've also done another project looking at how gentrification affects job opportunities for local residents, and I find evidence that in a pretty localized area, incumbent residents lose jobs in the presence of gentrification. There's kind of compensating gain farther away, but there does seem to be some loss of localized jobs in the context of gentrification. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be focusing on smaller establishments that serve the local community, because I really want to understand these neighborhood-based establishments. And the way I do that, and I'll if people have questions afterwards, I can get into the details. But I selected this as looking at kind of essentially the types of structures that would house those kinds of businesses. So I restricted my analysis. I'm going to be looking in New York City. I'll tell you about my data in a second, but really restricting it to the types of mixed-use buildings, smaller scale buildings that would house these more neighborhood-based, outward-facing businesses. I'm going to calculate just rates of retention and displacement, or exit, really, just to see, again, just to document the rates of businesses staying or exiting neighborhoods, and I'll tell you in a minute how I define those. And I'm also going to, when I talk about exit, I'm going to also be able to see when businesses exit, if an establishment comes in and replaces that business, or whether after that exit the space stays vacant. So I can observe that as well, and I'm interested in those differences as well. And then I'm going to look at these rates overall, and then I'm going to look at them across gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods, and I'll also explain to you how I define that in a second. I'm going to focus in on mixed-use neighborhoods. As I said, I'm going to look at just certain types of properties, really to hone in on the kind of the universe that I'm interested in here. And what I'm going to end up looking at is really almost like the within building life cycle of a business. So I really wanted to narrow in on a particular parcel and be able to see, right, when can a business stay there? When does an establishment leave it vacant? When does establishment leave, see one come in? And I'm looking at kind of 5-year intervals of cycling in and out. So that's how I'm setting up the analysis. So to do this, I'm looking at New York City. I'm looking at all the boroughs in New York City. I'm looking over across 2 decades. And I'm going to use the NETS data, which, again, there's lots of, I have a whole presentation on the limits of the NETS data, but the thing that is really useful about it is that it's point specific, and you can follow these establishments over time. That's really what's most valuable about it. And then you have information on the industry and the number of employees there. I do use that, although sparingly. And then I have a bunch of information on just the structural characteristics of properties from the Department of Finance and the Department of City Planning in the city. And then I pull in data from the Census and American Community Survey just on the neighborhood characteristics. Okay, so this is just baseline, right? I wanted to just understand overall what is the rate of turnover for businesses in general. And the top line story is most businesses stay in place, right? Those are the 2 top lines. Oh, and the other distinction, which is this is more being transparent than that it's necessary to make this entirely clear now. But I did differentiate between buildings that had single commercial spaces versus multiple commercial spaces. One of this was just kind of practical in terms of being able to, it's easier to identify this kind of cycling in a single, establishment building. But you also might think that a establishment might choose to locate in a single establishment building versus a multi-establishment building for different reasons as well. So there just might be different kind of dynamics at play in terms of why they move there and then potentially why they close and exit. So I wanted to keep those separate. Although in a minute I'm going to show you kind of averages, talk about averages across all of them. But so the blue are the single establishment, the green are the multi-establishments. I try to keep the color coding consistent throughout the presentation. But the point, they follow very similar, right? They're following similar trends. So most stay in place, and then the thick dotted line tells you the leave and replace, right? So these are the kind of the rate of leaving, and then another establishment coming in within. I think this is kind of within the next. Like I look at 5-year cycles, so within that cycle of business coming in, like during that time period. And then the finely dotted line are those that leave and then stay vacant, right? So the big takeaway here is most stay in place. We're not seeing like really, and this is consistent also if you look at national data in terms of retention, this is consistent with that as well. Okay, so the point was to set that up and then see, does that look different when we look across gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods? But first, let me tell you how I define gentrification. So my neighborhood is going to be a census tract. Again, a lot of this is motivated just by the utility of having that data available, right, at the census tract. But just to give you a sense, in this, in my study area, I think we looked at this. On average, it takes about 10 minutes to walk across a census tract in our city, right? So, I mean, it felt right also just as like a spatial unit, right, that someone, walks around and engages with in terms of how they consume local retail services. So when we think about gentrification, one of the prerequisites is really that you have to be almost eligible to gentrify, right? I mean, we don't really think of affluent neighborhoods as gentrifying. And so I needed to identify the neighborhoods that were situated on the spectrum as lower income, right? So what I ended up doing was I created a ratio here, and just so you know, there's a lot of different ways to understand and measure gentrification. It's not a conference on gentrification, but just so you know, I've replicated this with other kind of similar measures, looking at education and housing stock age and price appreciation, just to make sure we end up in the same place, and I do. So I went with an income-based metric because I think that is a lot of the underlying dynamic in what is driving gentrification as a process. So I set up a ratio, this is in 2000, where I take the average household income in the tract, in the neighborhood, and I put it as a ratio against the average household income in the MSA more broadly to give me a sense of the relative income, right? How poor is it in a sense relative to the spectrum of incomes in that MSA. And I take all the neighborhoods that are in the bottom 40th percentile of that distribution. So those are my low income neighborhoods. Those are the ones that are eligible to gentrify. And then I say it's going to gentrify over a decade. So I'm looking at the 90s, and then I'm going to look at the 2000s. And I'm going to say over the 2000s it's going to gentrify if that ratio basically, if that goes up. Right? So if the difference between the ratio in 08 and 2000 is greater than 1, it's going to gentrify. And again, you can play around with different magnitudes of increase, but we end up in the same place. So the big takeaway here is, what you want to look at is, but the purple is in the gentrifying neighborhoods, and the green is the non-gentrifying. So if you look at this, you see the purple and the green lines are very close together, right? So what that says is that there's not much difference in these rates across gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And again, I've sliced and diced it different ways, and the big takeaway is it does not seem to matter whether the neighborhood is gentrifying or not in terms of the average rate of displacement. And even there's slight differences in terms of whether it gets replaced or displaced or not, but overall we're not seeing different different rates across those kinds of neighborhoods. But what we do see, so when I dug in to try to understand what happens when businesses do leave, right? Is what happens in those spaces, does that differ across the types of neighborhoods? And I do see some differences there, right? So when businesses or establishments leave buildings and leave those spaces, in gentrifying neighborhoods, those spaces are more likely to sit vacant for longer periods of time if they're in gentrifying neighborhoods. The establishments that are leaving are actually less likely to be long-term establishments. So this kind of goes against the concern that gentrification is pushing out these establishments, again, on average, that have been there for longer. I also find that the establishments that come in tend to actually be smaller in terms of the number of employees that they have there than the ones that were there previously. So on average, the establishments are getting smaller in gentrifying neighborhoods. And the replacements, the establishments that come in, they do tend to bring in different services. So there is this transition in services, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, and they do tend to be chains. There's a slightly higher likelihood of the chains to come in gentrifying neighborhoods, although that tends to mostly happen in the 2000s. And just so you know, in these data, there are many more gentrifying neighborhoods in 2000 than the 1990s. So in the 1990s, about 5% of the 950 tracts that were designated as low income gentrified. In the 2000s, it was more like 30%. So the 2000s is really where a lot of this activity happened. So just, and I'm going to go through these quickly just to not violate my time here, but I just want to pull out. So this was a little, in all honesty, uncomfortable when I found these results, because it was not, again, it was counter to an expectation that you might have of the neighborhood is shifting. I expected to see more of a stark exit of establishments in gentrifying neighborhoods. So I wanted to drill down and understand if there was variation, at a localized level that I would observe. So I picked out a few neighborhoods. I'm going to show you a couple here just to show you, in fact, there is some more nuance to what's going on. So first we're going to travel to East Harlem, which is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And again, the color on this is not showing it as well, but to keep the color coding, again, I think the green was the gentrifying and the purple was the non-gentrifying. And here, historically, just so you know, Harlem has been a Latino enclave. A lot of Puerto Ricans have historically lived there. It's moderately transit accessible. It's one of, it had a lot of tracts that were designated low income based on my definition, and about half of them gentrified during the 2000s. So what I wanted to do here in these kind of drill downs is I picked neighborhoods that had both gentrifying and non-gentrifying tracts based on the definition I said before. So within kind of a micro neighborhood, I was able to look at the dynamics across those two kind of tracts over time. So for those of you who are econometrically inclined, I did almost like a mini difference in difference for each of these neighborhoods, because I looked at changes between the 90s and 2000s across gentrifying and non-gentrifying just to get a nice comparison in that area. And just so you know, during this time period too, empirically, we see an influx of white residents into that area. The population grew. So East Harlem is actually just emblematic of kind of all the things that happen with what we think of gentrification. So what happened there? In the 2000s, the gentrifying tracts actually saw a reduction in business retention in this neighborhood. And business displacement without replacement, meaning they sit there vacant, went down as well. So the spaces were being occupied more quickly in the gentrifying neighborhoods, and obviously with replacement went up. There was an increase in the number of chain businesses that went into this neighborhood over this time period, and this is relative to the non-gentrifying tracts. So this is all compared to that. And there was the largest relative gains in personal services, so like drugstores, educational services, and health services. And just to drill down to that a little bit more, I pulled out some examples. And this is, again, an example of what the next data can get you. You can get down to something like this. So we saw, again, the purple was the gentrifying. I apologize, I said the opposite before. And green was non-gentrifying. So these are just, these are absolute, but the bars give you a sense, right? So the number of drugstores jumped up much more in the gentrifying tracts compared to the non-gentrifying tracts. The number of doctors' offices went up. And the number of grocery stores wasn't as stark, but they definitely got more grocery stores in those areas as well, and restaurants. So I show this as an example of a case where gentrification seemed to bring in more services. Again, I can't say anything about the nature of the products or the prices at which these services are being offered, but this was an example where change was accompanied by entry of more services. Sunset Park, this is in the south west part of Brooklyn here. Again, historically a Latino but also Asian enclave. Pretty transit accessible, so similar to East Harlem in that way. Some different land use issues here. Again, I won't get into those either, but again, big low income, a lot of low income tracts, less gentrification happening here. So about a quarter of the tracts are gentrifying, and that's reflected also just in the demographic change, not as much of a dramatic shift in population or racial change. So what happened here in terms of how the business activity responded? So again, here retention went down. But here displacement without replacement went up. So in the case of East Harlem, there seemed to be, in gentrifying neighborhoods, a higher likelihood of establishments coming in to fill those empty spaces. That was not the case in Sunset Park. Chains, we saw a little more chains go in, and here there was a different kind of nature of service change, increase in food and restaurant establishments, whereas before we saw more personal service establishments. And these same charts, again, show that story in detail. I don't know if you remember, but right, the drugstore lines were way up. So we're not seeing drugstores go in here to gentrifying neighborhoods. Doctors, right, health services are not going in there. Grocery stores, the green is non-gentrifying. So if anything, we're seeing more jumps in the non-gentrifying areas over here. And then restaurants are going down. So this, again, is an illustration that this is an example of where gentrification is happening based on the definition I've set forth. Not as kind of aggressively as East Harlem, but it's there. And the services are not coming in with it, right? So this is kind of the other side of the coin. So gentrification is complicated. It's on a continuum. And what we observe kind of at this kind of systematic level, right, where there's no difference, looks very different when I drill down. But most businesses stay in place, and many of the long-standing ones are still there, right? So that gives some perspective. And on average, the exit rates are not elevated in gentrifying neighborhoods, right, across the whole city. That was not the case. However, when we drill down, retention rates were going down in places, and these spaces were not necessarily being replaced with, services that might come in and, enhance the quality of life of the community, again, with all the caveats I've said before about what we can observe in the data. And then the other thing that stood out is that storefronts can sit vacant, and this was across the whole city. Then in gentrifying neighborhoods, that seemed to be more prevalent. And the slight suggestion of a higher more entry in chains. And here, this is just maybe more something we can talk about in the end about, right, how do you respond to something like this? And the big theme is, it's obviously neighborhood based. It's very hard to say there's a one size fits all after looking at something like this, but just throwing some ideas out there. Okay.
Thank you.